Great. Well, thank you, Basil. It's a pleasure to be here this evening. Good evening, everybody. What we'd like to do this evening is actually to talk about the results of the work that we've been doing over the last year and a half, and what I'll do is I'll run through some of the contextual stuff, and Stephen will talk more about the modelling results and what they're actually beginning to tell us. And I use the word beginning deliberately because, you know, we don't see, having launched the report, that this is it and now it sits on people's shelves. Actually, we want them actually to be useful on an ongoing basis. So we want them actually just to be the start of the conversation about delivering a more resilient energy future in New Zealand. So more specifically, this is what we'll talk to you about this evening. Actually, but before we do, we'd like to play a video that hopefully neatly encapsulates what we've been trying to do. Well, hopefully you'll agree that kind of captures a good overview of our project. In fact, you're the first public audience to see that. We tried to play this at the launch, and it was a meltdown. So just before I get into some of the detail, I'd like to briefly introduce you actually to the Business New Zealand Energy Council. For those of you who haven't heard of it, first and foremost, actually it's a part of New Zealand's largest business advocacy body, Business New Zealand. We established the BEC at the beginning of 2013. Its members come from right across the energy sector, and importantly from government, academia and business. And you'll see, in fact you would have seen from some of the logos on the end of that film, that that mix was more than present in the development of our scenarios, and importantly added strength and robustness to the work that we did. Actually, I'm interested, who's heard of put up your hands if you've heard of the World Energy Council? Oh, okay. Oh, well, that's actually more than I thought, because generally when you talk to audiences, people think about the IEA as the natural default, but the World Energy Council is the principal impartial network of leaders and practitioners promoting the affordable, stable and environmental sustainable energy system for all. They've been around since 1923. They've got about 100, actually it's now up to about 100 member committees, covering over 3,000 member organisations, and again it's across that spectrum. In a nutshell, actually they're a global energy thought leader, much larger of course than the IEA, with a bottom-up network that actually allows for some, well, we call it truth-telling and myth-busting, and in fact they were kind of characteristics that attracted us to become a part of the World Energy Council. So what got us actually to the point of doing this groundbreaking bit of work? Well, it was essentially this equation. I mean, it might seem a bit, on first blush, a bit of an odd statement, but let me explain. I mean, in essence, the global energy system is increasingly and rapidly becoming more and more complex. There used to be just one price signal. It used to be the price of oil, but now we've got multiple price signals. Regional gas hubs, the carbon price, solar and battery technology costs. And so all of these now are influential in when thinking about future investments and the relativities between those investments. And if you like fast food, well actually now we've got fast energy. It used to be that the quickest period of time to turn over a piece of energy infrastructure was actually the car, and that was at around 10 years plus, so that actually wasn't very quick at all. But you know, now we've got the impact of shale oil and gas in the US, the collapsing solar and battery prices, and of course the rise of the prosumer. So with growing global uncertainty plus fast energy, with growing global complexity plus fast energy, you've got uncertainty. And basically, we thought there was a gap in the New Zealand energy toolbox that would help decision makers like you identify and manage that uncertainty and complexity. And of course, this isn't just it's very easy to think that's kind of out there. It's not us. Well, it's not just a global discussion, it's actually happening here in New Zealand on almost a daily basis. You open the Herald every morning, there'll be another energy-related headline. And so here are some, all of those will be fairly familiar, I would imagine, with all of you. So that just speaks to the drive to actually help domestically with a piece of work that will shed light on, again, that complexity and uncertainty. So why scenarios? Well, as I said, we think that they were helpful. We know that the global and domestic energy system is undergoing significant changes, and that the pace of change, as I said, is increasing, and in no small part, of course, to consumers' increasing propensity to adopt new technology. And so in this situation, actually, we got to the point where we thought, in the absence of useful information that will actually, again, help decision makers like you to make informed decisions about what are those trade-offs around factors like energy security, energy equities, and in New Zealand's case, an affordability question, and environmental sustainability. And so we kind of figured that the absence of that information was palpable. And we all know, of course, that our ability to predict beyond the next few years is seriously challenged, and that traditional forecasting or normative approaches actually begin to lose relevance the further you go out into the future. And so the other key benefit of doing this scenarios work was the ability to quantify them. So what we've delivered is hopefully quite a data-rich set of scenarios. What we think that the data will do will actually help reveal make more transparent where those trade-offs are, what some of the choices, the trade-offs and their impacts are in a real way. And of course, while we're talking out to 2050, the whole idea of looking out to the future is that it will help us make better decisions about the future today. And the last point there, we talk about resilience, and that was one of the strong themes that came out during the project, just in terms of both energy policy and investment decision making. What we wanted to do is help build greater resilience into our future decisions. And of course, resilience itself isn't an end point. It's an enduring test of what we do. So I know, of course, the question on everyone's lips is, did we have to start this project from scratch? Well, it's a great question. Our relationship to the World Energy Council actually gave us a huge leg up in terms of getting this thing off the ground, because what we do is draw off the work that the World Energy Council did. So what we'll do is fairly quickly run through the World Energy Council elements of this, introduce you to the WEC scenarios themselves. Is what they do is they formed a very important backdrop to the work that we did. In essence, what the WEC did was develop two stories with the help of its member committees, of which New Zealand is one, and in fact we had a New Zealander who chaired their scenarios study group. And in essence, what we've got down here are the three tests which they lived by, and in fact that we lived by. Their conceptual approach was to develop scenarios that met those three tests. Were they plausible, were they distinct, and were they coherent? Now, I can tell you that it's a lot easier to say that than it is to deliver them in practice. And that's actually part of the challenge, and I'm happy to say actually part of why this project took us 16, 17 odd months to land. The amount of anguishing, in fact, we had to go over the storylines, because each storyline embeds a certain set of cultural, economic, environmental, social institutions. And so if you started, if someone would say, well, how about X? And you're going to think, well, does that drive your stories closer or further apart? And if you change X, what does that mean to A and B within that storyline? So it was actually, in fact, without those three tests, I think we'd probably still be arguing about our storyline. So it was actually an incredibly strong discipline. So the idea of the WEC scenarios, and so our scenarios, was essentially to portray a range of equally conceivable outcomes, and to aid in the understanding of how different factors can interact and shape the future. And so to identify the robust what-ifs and actually critically again for our scenarios were to develop scenarios that were neither right nor wrong, good nor bad, that they were intended and needed to be robust, to be a mix of all of those features. And so here's a brief outline of each of the two WEC scenario stories or narratives. Now I won't go through these, you can read them for yourself, other than actually to say the critical uncertainties that helped form the WEC scenarios were based around the role of markets and governments. And so there was a decentralised versus orchestrated, market-led versus government-led sense that plays out across their storylines. And I have to say, while this helped shape our stories, we certainly worked hard with a wide range of stakeholders here in New Zealand to define our own critical uncertainties and how they played out in the stories. And actually, interestingly, look, you know, we all know what scenarios are, right? Well, actually, our experience is you get 10 people in a room, you actually get 15 different views about what scenarios are. And, you know, we've all seen a variety of scenarios. So we've got the transmission grid scenarios, we've got MB with their, I'm going to use another acronym, I'm not too sure what it stands for, EDGES, electricity generation demand scenarios. We've got transport scenarios out to 2042, but the uniqueness of our scenarios is that they're across the entire energy sector. And in fact, it must be the 80s, I think, and by government rather than a business-led initiative where those such scenarios were last done. And so that was actually part of the opportunity to actually help reinvigorate a conversation around business and back into policymakers about the usefulness of scenarios, well, actually what scenarios are and their usefulness. And having said that the WEC scenarios provided context for our scenarios, you know, the stories we've told and the modelling inputs we've used are most definitely New Zealand orientated, and Stephen will talk more about the modelling inputs in a couple of minutes. So in fact we wanted, and in fact we liked the idea of to be able to come up with our own unique stories about New Zealand's energy future, but actually to be able to look at them through a rest of the world jazz and a rest of the world symphony lens out of the WEC scenarios and the framework that provided. And actually, thankfully, so did a whole bunch of other organisations. They saw the opportunity as well, and you look at that and it's pretty much a who's who of organisations with an interest in the energy sector. You know, there was a wide range of others who also saw the potential for the development of some robust, plausible scenarios, and here they are. So this speaks to the robustness, I think, of what we've done. It wasn't just Business New Zealand with the help of Stephen or actually with the help of Stephen. It wasn't just us who went into a dark room and popped out 15 months later a set of our own stories. These organisations were all active from the get-go right through the development of the storylines, the input assumptions we used, and in fact how we are now talking about them. So it was pretty comprehensive and pretty robust input. They weren't silent sponsors but active participants. And importantly, we had strong buy-in from government, and I'm pleased to see that in fact they're already using kayak and waka and their assumptions in their briefings to government. So that's great from our perspective. And it's also actually extremely hard to believe. In fact, we've had an article in Energy News recently, and someone's put a comment down the bottom saying that we've got our head stuck somewhere that I won't mention. But it's actually quite hard to believe that the Ministry, in fact it's about coal buckets, the Ministry for the Environment and Meridian would have their heads largely stuck in their coal buckets. It's just hard to believe that, you know, when you look at that group there. Oh, and I think Stephen.
Thank you, John, and thank you, Basil, for inviting us along again. It's a pleasure to be here. And just moving back to that previous slide, because I will touch on it briefly. The sheer range and diversity of companies sitting around a single table certainly presented some challenges, but is also testimony, I think, to John's vision and tenacity in getting them on board. I mean, I don't know whether any of you have tried to do these multi-party, multi-company things, but my goodness, getting that range of people, government, research organisations and industry around the table also gave us the odd headache, but it was a fantastic job pulling that together, John. My role in the project was to support John primarily just through managing the project and principally the modelling, which I'll talk about in a minute. The first task we came across in the project was to create the storylines themselves, and in order to do that we were limited to 2, so you can imagine all the different potential views, even in this room, about what some scenarios about the future. We had to boil that down to 2 to line up with WEC's modelling, which was the jazz and symphony. So as John indicated before, the context for these storylines where the rest of the world is in the market-led jazz, in one scenario the rest of the world is in the government-led symphony, and the rest of the world. What would that then mean for New Zealand if those 2 global contexts persisted? And the way we did this is we got together 3 workshops principally with a much wider range of people than just the logos on that previous slide. We had the Salvation Army, we had the youth delegation, Gen Zero, a range of sort of outside the energy industry, because we didn't want this to be essentially an energy industry project where all we thought about was kilowatt hours and petajoules. And so we did get a decent range of people in that room, and believe me, that was an absolute hoot. You could imagine some of the views that were being expressed around the room quite vociferously about how the world was going to play out under these different scenarios. And at the end of the day, with 30, 40 odd people in each of these workshops that we ran, we boiled it down to, John mentioned critical uncertainties. There were 19 critical uncertainties for New Zealand, among which some of the key ones was exactly what you articulated before, Basil, which is things like global growth, geopolitical instability, climate change, and disruptive technologies, all featured in the top part of those critical uncertainties. Then we likened it to a game of Twister. How do you sort of combine the different potential outcomes of each of those uncertainties into 2 plausible, coherent and distinct storylines? I'd just like to acknowledge one other person, Aaron Webb from PwC's in the room. Now, Aaron and PwC were huge supporters of particularly this part of the process, and this was seriously difficult. So writing those storylines up into something that actually made coherent sense was an enormous task. So thank you, Aaron, for doing that. The 2 names, as John mentioned, we came up with. Kayak was our name for the scenario that came out of the dynamic jazz world. Waka was the more orchestrated world that we believe New Zealand in its own way would move into when the rest of the world was in symphony. And hopefully it's reasonably obvious why we chose those 2 names. The kayak, you're in it by yourself and dynamically paddling where you want to go. Waka, very much everyone's paddling in the same direction. If you don't want to go there, you better just hop off the boat. No life jackets. The quantification, I've very much summarised at a high level the inputs here in the full document, which is up on the BEC website. You can see all the actual numbers that sat next to these, but I'm just going to quickly talk you through some of the inputs that went in here. Now, I want you to bear in mind that there were potentially any number of combinations of these critical uncertainties that we could have introduced. We were both aiming for plausibility and coherence, but also distinction. We wanted the 2 paths to actually deviate. The last thing we wanted was the 2 things to kind of collapse into the middle and have 2 scenarios that basically said the same thing. So we reasoned under kayak, population would be higher. Under that market-led scenario, immigration would be a lot higher, a lot freer in terms of immigration. Wouldn't be much change to the underlying native population growth, but immigration would be the key differentiating factor, whereas under Waka, you would have a lot more stringent control on what's happening around immigration to take the pressure off resources in the country. GDP per capita higher in kayak. The WEC modelling for the rest of the world suggested that Southeast Asia, China, Australia were growing a lot stronger. Their economies were growing a lot stronger in the kayak scenario, whereas, as we'll come to in a minute, principally because of the carbon agreements, those economies were growing less strongly in the waka scenario. So it made sense from an export perspective that we would reflect those assumptions in the GDP per capita. So you can see just those first two assumptions immediately set you on a path of strong growth in one and not so strong growth in the other. You've got higher population and higher GDP per capita in one, and lower, your population isn't declining, but you've got lower growth and lower GDP per capita in the other. The third one up there, carbon agreements, was another critical differentiating factor. So here, under the kayak scenario, you don't get a strong outcome out of Paris. You end up with regionalised carbon approaches, fragmented across the globe, different economies taking different approaches to carbon. At the end of that, cutting to the chase, you get carbon prices of about Kiwi 60 a tonne by the time you get to 2050. That's in real terms. Now, some people look at that and go, well, I wouldn't call that low. Still $60 a tonne Kiwi by 2050. But if you flip across to waka, under that you have a binding, globally binding and strong agreement come out of Paris, and you end up going on a path to almost twice that in terms of your carbon price by the time you get to 2050. And just to be clear, yes, for the modelling we assumed it was a carbon price. In the storylines we said actually the price could be achieved, or the equivalent of the price could be achieved in a number of different ways. You might just go for quantity limits, you might just go for different frameworks, but ultimately for modelling you needed a price to go in there, and the key thing is it's roughly twice as severe as what happens under kayak. And resources, very quickly, those electricity demand and generation scenarios were where we got most of the inputs for our electricity generation plant. The lower cost of gas exploration in kayak was the only way we could reflect what we believe was an increased chance of exploration and discovery under the kayak scenario as opposed to waka. The coal to liquids without CCS is a bit of an odd one to throw up there. You wouldn't have thought we would have to make an assumption about whether carbon capture and storage was bolted onto a CTL plant, but we did, and I'll come to that later on. Technology support in the kayak free market world, obviously no subsidies of any kind in the kayak scenario, but under the waka scenario we had three key elements to our technology support. There was a subsidy of biofuels of 20%. There was what we called a facilitation of large hydro, because we reasoned in the waka scenario, in our storyline, there was a government that was doing its best to chase 100% renewables and therefore would be more comfortable pushing through large hydro projects under the RMA. And energy efficiency policies, these were a lot stronger under the waka scenario, where you had things like ban on coal boilers, ban on incandescent light bulbs. So any reasonable practical thing that a government could do to encourage energy efficiency was implemented in waka. Consumption behaviour, price-based again under kayak, and people just responding to price principally, but under waka we had significantly reduced light vehicle fleet use by about 20% by the time you get to 2050. So from roughly 12,000 vehicle kilometres travelled per vehicle at the moment down to 9,800 for the light fleet. So that's actually quite significant, and you'll see those results come through shortly as to what that means. So that's a very quick whistle-stop tour through the input assumptions. There's oodles more in the document if you want to scratch into the actual numbers and see what's going on. Key messages that come out of the outputs, which I'm just going to touch on briefly now. Now, John has pretty much covered all these quite comprehensively in terms of the messages, the meta messages that kind of came out of the scenario modelling project. What I want to get onto is some of the key modelling outputs. So firstly, we start at the highest level with this full energy system model, and I should reiterate, as a full energy system model. The modelling was conducted by a group called the Poolsherer Institute in Switzerland. They're the largest federally funded research centre in all of Switzerland, and believe me, working with a German and Swiss modeller at midnight, yeah, that was fun. Very precise. Everything was very precise. It's a wonder there's not 7 decimal places on each of these numbers up on the chart, actually. So the first thing, based on Markel model, for those of you that have been familiar with sort of energy economy models, it's based around Markel, highly deterministic, perfect foresight model, but one that brings out the key interconnections. So, energy demand. First thing here, energy demand is predicted in the waka scenario to go down. Now, for a lot of people, that raises a few eyebrows. The fact that this is total energy demand could go down. And it does under the waka scenario, about 23% compared to going up 15 or 18% in the kayak scenario. So you can see that the key differentiating factor, I'll have a pointer here, the key differentiating factor between the two scenarios is really that blue bar at the bottom, which is oil. Okay, and we'll come to that in a couple of slides when we talk about what happens in the transport sector. But largely everything else grows to some extent. Main other differentiating factor, this is today, this bar here, sort of, I don't know what you'd call that colour, is coal, and interestingly in both scenarios it reduces significantly, but more so in waka. So even the $60 a tonne carbon price is enough to seriously diminish the country's consumption of coal as a primary fuel. But the key take out of this is that potential declining energy consumption between now and 2050 in the waka scenario. Moving to electricity, within that, effectively you see again two different growth paths, but you do see growth in both. The the kayak electricity demand, if you think about demand, this is a graph of supply, but if you think about the equivalent demand, it's roughly equivalent to 1.2% compounding growth between now and 2050. Now, for those of you who are familiar with what's happened over the last 20 or so years in electricity, we've probably seen on average somewhere between 1.4 and 1.6% growth in electricity. The last 5 or 6 years have been a little bit different from that, but certainly over a longer time period, you're sitting at around 1.6%. So this is predicting already in the high growth scenario a lower compounding annual growth of electricity demand than what we've observed over the last couple of decades. But again, it's not quite half that, but about 2/3 of that rate under the waka scenario. And that is largely because of those energy efficiency policies, which you talked about before, as well as lower population growth and GDP growth playing out in there. Key difference between these two scenarios, well, firstly, under kayak, you only get to 85% renewables in your electricity supply chain, whereas you get to 98% in waka. Now, John and I literally concluded the modelling, I think it was a day before Huntly announced that it was shutting down, which was 2 days before Otahu announced it was shutting down. And we sat there going, I can't believe it, we've just made 2 predictions and we're already well on our way to, well, at least it was 80% last year, but potentially by 2020 you'll see a much higher percentage of renewables, which is fantastic news. I argue it's a perfect demonstration of why scenarios are so good, because the number will land somewhere in the middle. So there you go, we had it right. The 98% is of some significant interest to people who think, well, can you actually feasibly get to 98% renewables in your electricity system, given the vagaries of hydro in particular? And the way the model's doing it in this particular instance, and you can see it to some extent here, this y-axis here is generation per year rather than capacity, just to be clear. And you'll notice that in the waka scenario, you only see a tiny sliver of gas plant up here, and that's one of the reasons you're getting a 98%. But what's sitting behind that, if I had a graph of gas capacity that was available, it's substantially more than what that line would have. It's about 1,100 megawatts of gas plant that's running at around 10% load factors. Now, if you go and ask Contact and Genesis what load factors they like their gas plant running on, it's a lot higher than 10%. So you've actually got a whole lot of kit here lying around waiting for the lakes to go a bit dry. Think about the commercial frameworks you have to think about in order for that to be realistic, but that's how the model is still satisfying 98% renewable in an average hydro year. In terms of other key differences or factors of the scenario, you can see that the growth is principally coming from geothermal and wind. They go up nearly 3-fold in both scenarios. Hydro plays a bit of a stronger role in waka than kayak. That reflects that facilitation of large hydro. You see a bit more of the 250, 300 megawatt hydro projects appearing in waka than you do in kayak. In fact, there's only, I think, 1 or 2 hydro projects built over the horizon in kayak. Transport. Now, this is probably one of the most fascinating results of the scenarios that we had. You remember on that first chart, one of the big differentiating factors between primary energy consumption between 2 scenarios was oil. And you can see exactly what's going on here. So in the kayak scenario here, internal combustion engine vehicles, so this is just your traditional ICE here, doesn't grow much from today. Most of the growth is met by this orange bar here, which is your liquid fueled hybrid. So this is your Priuses and your Camrys and that kind of thing. So you're not plugging something into the grid, you're just chucking a battery in it to effectively make the internal combustion engine more efficient. So that's where the growth principally comes from in the kayak scenario. However, under the waka scenario, firstly you have slightly fewer vehicles, and that was a result of one of our assumptions that in waka the urban design would be up, not out. You'd probably have people owning fewer cars and they'd be more likely to pick up alternative modes of transport, so that drives the number of new cars down to about 4.1 million versus about 4.8 million in kayak. But the real difference between these two is what happens to the internal combustion engine in waka. The combination of battery costs, the oil price with the carbon uplift, and the electricity price sees quite a different vehicle fleet over in the waka scenario in 2050. You've still got your hybrids there, your non-plug-in hybrids, but around 2 million of your 4.1 vehicles on the road, 4.1 million vehicles on the road, are derivatives of electric cars, either electric vehicles or plug-in hybrids. And you can see we also get a lovely little purple hydrogen option up the top. The way I interpret that is not that I necessarily believe that this would be the shares that you would see in transport at that point, but it's an indicator that actually any of these options could potentially come to fruition. Originally, when we ran our first round of modelling, we allowed it to pick CNG as an option there, and sure enough, in the waka scenario, you had CNG cars, you had hydrogen cars, you had electric cars, you had internal combustion, you had everything under the sun. And we sat around as a project team and said, would New Zealand seriously fund and build the infrastructure to support the distribution of hydrogen as a fuel, gas as a fuel, electricity as a fuel, petrol and diesel as a fuel, as well as build out public transport? Probably not. So we limited one of those options. It's largely, I'll blame it on Z Energy, who said we're going around ripping out the CNG tanks from all the petrol stations at the moment, and we limited it to these. But the point is, which of the electric or hydrogen thing eventuates is probably largely going to be determined by global factors, although New Zealand does have a unique opportunity in that respect. Very quickly, one thing we did play around with the Swiss and German modelers was the cost of batteries. One of the great difficulties with the assumptions in this model is it seemed like every time you agreed an assumption, Deutsche Bank would come out with another report saying battery costs are going to drop another 20% over the next 5 years. So we thought rather than keep updating the battery cost, we would try and benchmark it to what WEC had originally assumed, which was $300 per kilowatt hour for motor vehicle batteries, electric vehicles batteries. We updated it to sort of a bit of an ensemble forecast based on analyst reports and various things at the time, which was this number 340 New Zealand dollars, which equates to 220 US, which seems to be now what most of the analysts are predicting for the next few years in terms of battery costs per kilowatt hour. And then we went a bit Tony Seba and went for what's $75 US a kilowatt hour, 115 Kiwi. And what you can see, interestingly, and it just plays to, some of you may have seen, I think it's a Bloomberg New Energy Finance picture, which I think has battery costs along the x-axis and it might be oil price up the right axis, and it's this lovely little mosaic that has a whole lot of lines going across it, that if you end up in this zone, you end up with non-plug-in hybrids. If you end up over in this zone with really cheap batteries and cheap electricity relative to oil, you end up with electric vehicles, or if you don't get that, you end up with ICEs. Fascinating graph. And this almost reflects that as your battery costs begin to come down, you actually originally see them picked up by hybrid vehicles, because oil's still relatively cheap enough for it to warrant sticking smaller batteries in cars to make more efficient use of oil relative to the cost of electricity build and turning it into cars. Whereas you do get to a point somewhere between 340 Kiwi and 115 Kiwi, where all of a sudden battery costs become so cheap you might as well stick big batteries in cars, suck the juice from the grid and run them on that. So somewhere in there, and we didn't explore exactly where, somewhere between $340 and $115 a kilowatt hour, there's probably a tipping point. As typical of these very linear perfect foresight models, they just reach a point where they switch and jump across to another solution. You all of a sudden got a very waka-ish outcome in the kayak scenario. So that's basically what we're trying to prompt the model to do. Could you end up with an uptake of significant electric vehicles in a kayak world with a lowish carbon price, similar to what you get in waka? In terms of carbon emissions, you can see there that compared to current, you make some reductions in carbon emissions by 2050, only 4 million tonnes between now and then, versus getting a reduction of about 16 million tonnes between now and then under the waka scenario. Now, the first thing most people notice when John and I put this chart up is, you can see here we've plotted the 11% below 1990 energy emissions as though it was applied to the energy sector, because it's not applied to the energy sector. But if it were just taken as a sub-target and applied to gross energy sector emissions, it would be that dashed line there. And of course, you only get there after 2040, according to this. Now, this is gross. It's ignoring sequestration, forestry, and all that kind of thing. So, which of course happens at the aggregate level. But it is interesting for people to say, for all that aggressive assumption and reduction in driving behaviour, reduction in the motorisation rate, uptake of public transport, rollout of renewables to 98% in the electricity sector, almost elimination of coal from the supply chain, your carbon reduction target is not met till around 2040. How much money are we going to spend? Now, this amount of money here, just before you think that's really cheap, it's just in the electricity sector, the $15 billion, $15.4 billion in kayak, $14.4 billion in waka. The question this naturally begs is, what does that mean for prices, which is the question on everyone's lips when they see these numbers. What's going to happen to electricity prices as a result of this? Now, this model is a fundamental model. It goes bottom up, just like it doesn't take in an oil price forecast. It actually says, what do I need to do to dig, explore, extract, and convert oil, rather than what's my oil price forecast. In the same way as it does that for electricity. What does it cost me to effectively explore and build power stations? You can infer electricity prices from this, and all I can say is watch that space, because Aaron and I have some work to do on that front to infer the long run marginal costs out of this. But it's important to remember that once you're talking about a 35-year time frame, a huge amount of your investment cost is because of the economic retirement of existing plant. So, you know, depending on what you assume about the life of a wind farm or a geothermal power station, 40 years is a long time for some of those plants that are existing now. They have to be refurbished, or even more dramatic than that. We did assume in this, the first round of the modelling effectively rebuilt the entire Waitaki scheme in about 2030, because it was end of economic life. I personally didn't see the concrete coming out of those dams anytime soon, and so we did push the hydro refurbishment out beyond 2050, but certainly in terms of geothermal, wind and gas, it's a very real consideration and makes up a good chunk of the investment costs here. Reflections on the results. I'm sure you've got a whole lot of reflections on the results, which we can talk about in a second, because we're going to do Q&A. Heavy interplay of electricity, renewables, transports, emission reductions. That on that emission reduction chart here, just to be clear, about 2/3 of this difference between kayak and waka in 2050 is the transport difference. So that's your electric vehicles coming in running on renewable electricity. So that interplay between the sectors, John talked about at the start, there's no longer one price, there's these multiple prices, it's heavily interconnected, very much came through in the modelling in terms of understanding where emissions reductions could come from. That includes that double whammy of renewable abundance. Transport's going to be the place where we can leverage that. And I didn't actually talk about solar. I will just quickly go back, that was my mistake. Back here in electricity, the solar is, I mean, it looks tiny on that chart. That's production per year. But in kayak, the market-led scenario, it's equivalent to a solar panel of 3 or 4 kilowatts on the roof of every second house in New Zealand, 950,000 households in the kayak scenario. In the waka scenario, it's only 350,000 households. So you get a lower uptake of solar in the waka scenario than you do in kayak. Remember, we didn't subsidise solar, so a lot of people associate high solar uptake with government getting involved in subsidising. We didn't do that. So it was actually the growth that came out of the kayak scenario that kept driving you up the cost curve that ultimately triggered the higher solar uptake. So one solar panel on every second household to me seems quite different from today. John, do you want to finish on these slides, or do you want me to? You want me to? Scenario thinking, so just back up the truck a little bit from before the results. It's years since Peter Schwartz wrote The Art of the Long View, which was sort of one of those seminal texts on how you do good scenario thinking. And sometimes I wonder why we don't see more good comprehensive scenario thinking going on. That's because it's flippin' hard. It is really hard, and John used the word anguish before. We thought of plenty of things that we would have liked to have got into the scenarios, but you had to force yourself to be disciplined. Is it plausible? Is it coherent? Is it distinct? Are we just doing the and then magic happens type assumption? So the slow methodical process of identifying those 19 critical uncertainties paid dividends in the long run. We can trace every single one of those results back to a discussion that happened at Group F on the first workshop, so that we can audit that whole thing, and that paid dividends in the long run and gave us that touch point to go back to. Keeping the storylines away from what we think will happen. A scenario is not what you think will happen. It has to be just a plausible thing of what might happen. And particularly because a lot of people were tempted to say, oh, your market-led kayak scenario, isn't that just kind of the scenario we're in at the moment? I'm sure a lot of you have wondered that, isn't that just that current status quo if it continued on? And actually, until you ask someone, well, no, now tell me another story. And it forces you to go back to your kayak assumption and go, actually, are we being extreme enough in terms of maybe the status quo could be pushed out a little bit. And so constantly we were disciplining and challenging ourselves to be a bit more extreme. And doing that with 20 project partners around the table, all who were magnificent in that exercise, I'd say, was real challenging. Reality is we're going to paddle somewhere between, excuse the pun on the kayak and waka thing, we are going to paddle a path somewhere between those storylines. We don't say we're going to paddle up the middle. I don't know where it's going to be between those two. All we've done is say, out here are two plausible, I wouldn't even call them boundaries or extremes, the sort of a couple of standard deviations away from the mean maybe. Where we go in that, don't know, we can talk about that and we can argue about it. And you don't have to agree with those scenario storylines, because all you have to accept is that they're plausible. A lot of people are looking for wild cards, they're looking for breakthrough technologies, they're looking for that kind of thing in the storylines. But there are one or two in there, carbon capture and storage and solar costs coming down and battery costs coming down. But to package a whole lot of them together and have it's definitely not the Goldilocks, but the sort of the magnificent breakthrough in all technology scenario would have lost some credibility. And as I say at the end, there's no substitute for anguishing and constantly revisiting. Even energy intensity caused us probably more headaches than just about any other. What is New Zealand's energy intensity going to be if it goes on each of these things? Does that make sense? What's going to happen to industrial versus commercial versus residential? Spent a lot of time on that. So in terms of what we've achieved here, first and foremost, we think it's a robust framework to start talking about some of these things. In many ways, the project raises more questions than it actually answers. You look at some of these things, you just go, well, hang on, why does that happen? Do I agree with it? Would you really run out of cheap renewables and start building coal plus CCS or gas plant again in a kayak? Does that seem plausible? It is 35 years away. That's the kind of conversations we wanted to start, but to have, I guess, a common vocabulary to do that rather than everyone turning up with their own little model that they had done. We think the platform and the vocabulary on which this is based is something that we can all use, and as John indicated before, has already been starting to be picked up by government. Yeah. So, is there one more? Oh, sorry. Yeah. Complexity plus speed equals uncertainty from John's first slide, and scenarios very much helpful to move us outside of those ideological biases that we typically have. All of us have a set of biases that influence the way we think about the future. We hope these scenarios challenge those biases and challenge you to question maybe there are other stories in there. And also we don't have to make those disconnected, unrealistic assumptions. We have to stay disciplined to that. And the modelling, the output of a model is just a function of the inputs you stick into it. There's nothing magic about it, but it does help you reconcile a lot of those more complex dimensions, such as the ones we've talked about here.